Good evening, everyone. My name, for those who haven't met me, my name is Adam Hinks. I'm a professor in the Department of Astronomy and Astrophysics, and I also teach in the Christianity and Culture program. Like our speaker this evening, I'm a Jesuit, and so I'm a colleague of Brother Guy. I'm an adjunct scholar at the Vatican Observatory, so you might say he's also one of my bosses. Before I get to some practicalities and introduce our speaker, I'd like to invite our president, Dr. David Sylvester, to welcome everyone to this evening.
Thanks, Adam. You don't have to clap for the president. He just gets up here to welcome people. So it is my pleasure to welcome you. And I want to begin with a land acknowledgement, as is our custom. So here at St. Mike's, we wish to acknowledge that this land that the University of St. Michael's College operates for thousands of years, it has been the traditional land of the Huron-Wendat, the Seneca, and the Mississaugas of the Credit. And today, this meeting place is still the home to many Indigenous people from across Turtle Island, and we are all very grateful for the opportunity to work here. So I am very, very happy to welcome you here for a lot of reasons. One of them is personal, because I haven't seen Brother Guy for a long time. He doesn't know me, but I heard him speak at the planetarium in Vancouver before I ever became a university president. So that's many, many years ago, but I remember. So I want to see how much your pitch has changed and what we've all learned since then. But the other reasons aren't personal, they're institutional. One is that St. Mike's has a very unique place here at the University of Toronto in that we have a long history. It's our 170th anniversary this month on this very space at the University of Toronto, with a strong interdisciplinary and humanities background. So as U of T has a very strong focus on science, astrophysics, AI, a variety of other areas, we think we have an opportunity to be a human voice in that conversation. And we try very hard to do that, whether it's through our Christianity and Culture program, through appointments like Adam's, through very many others. So there's a reason that it makes sense for Brother Guy to be here today. But most importantly from today is that it's Michaelmas. This is our patronal feast day. This is our Founders Day, if you like. St. Michael didn't found St. Michael's University of St. Michael's College, but it's the day we celebrate our history. And after 2 years, to gather together on this campus where we had over 300 people in the celebrations and food trucks and eating together and celebrating together, it has been a very special day for this community. And I can't think of a better way to top it off than to welcome an international renowned scholar like Brother Guy. So, Adam, over to you, and welcome everyone.
Thank you, David. Just a couple of practical notes. The bathrooms on this level, there is a men's room and a women's room. They are open, but they might lock. If they do lock, we have access keys here. So just approach me if you're having trouble with that, but they should be open. And then also just to note, this lecture is being recorded, so it will be available afterwards. I'll just say a couple of words about the sponsors, then I'll say a couple of words about Brother Guy, and then we can actually have the talk we're all waiting for. So Brother Guy is being hosted here by the Christianity and Culture program here at the University of St. Michael's College. We have several students here. We offer a number of courses that deal with Christianity and culture, including courses on science and faith. So if you're a student and you're interested in kind of continuing the topic, look up our courses online. It's also being hosted by the Society of Catholic Scientists. This is an organization of professional scientists ranging from undergraduate students through to professors. If you're interested in knowing more about the society, come and approach me afterwards and I can tell you about it. And then finally, our third sponsor is the Toronto Jesuit History Research Group, which is a really interdisciplinary initiative across campus from a number of departments. So all three of these groups are very happy to welcome Brother Guy. So Brother Guy's originally, he's practically Canadian. He's from Detroit, Michigan, and he was just telling me that when he was growing up, they had a boat in Sarnia. So welcome home.
I tell people I was born north of Canada.
Yeah, which is true if you look at a map. Brother Guy did a bachelor's degree and a master's degree at MIT, the Massachusetts Institute of Technology. He then went on to do a PhD in planetary science at the University of Arizona, completing that in 1978. He went on to do postdocs at Harvard College Observatory and at MIT. And then he did something different. He left academia to volunteer and joined the Peace Corps and went abroad and ended up in Kenya, where, believe it or not, he was put to work teaching physics. So he couldn't get away from physics. He returned to the US. He was a professor at Lafayette College in Pennsylvania. And then he took another turn in his life and decided to enter the Society of Jesus and become a Jesuit, and entered in 1989. He did philosophy and theology studies at Loyola University Chicago. And in 1993, he was missioned to the Vatican Observatory. So the Vatican Observatory has roots in the 16th century, founded in its current form by Pope Leo XIII in the 1890s. And its mission is to do original astronomy research. He was appointed the director of the Vatican Observatory by Pope Francis in 2015. So he's often unofficially called the Pope's astronomer. His research area is in asteroids and meteorites, and he's a specialist in determining their physical characteristics. And he used to be the curator of the Vatican Meteorite Collection, which is a world-class collection. He's a member of the Pontifical Academy of Sciences, the American Astronomical Society Division for Planetary Sciences, the Meteorological Society, and the International Astronomical Union. And in that latter body, the International Astronomical Union, he was part of the group that made the decision to demote Pluto from being a planet to a dwarf planet.
Not a demotion. It's not a demotion. Don't get me started.
He's widely published. His most recent book, which was co-authored with colleague Father Paul Muller, is called Would You Baptize an Extraterrestrial? And Other Questions from the Astronomer's Inbox at the Vatican Observatory, which I highly recommend. He has an honorary doctorate from Georgetown University, and he won the Carl Sagan Medal a few years ago. So let me just finish with a quote from the citation from that award. Quote, "He is a careful and well-respected researcher, a vibrant member of the planetary science community, and an outstanding communicator of planetary science to the public in the very best tradition of Carl Sagan." Please join me in welcoming Brother Guy Consolmagno.
Thank you. Thanks. And it's really great to be here. Thanks for having me. I love Toronto, what can I say? Don't tell my Detroit friends, but I do love it here. Adam mentioned books. A book that came out about 10 years ago was called God's Mechanics. And when we were trying to come up with a cover, I suggested to them that you could do a takeoff of this wonderful, about 1920s popular mechanics magazine. You could, make it just a little bit different. And, instead of having something magnetic there, you could have the monstrance up there. They instead decided to do that, which is not nearly as much fun. I apologize. It's probably why the book has gone out of print, and if you need a copy, you're going to have to buy an e-copy, because that's all that's there. So much for advertising my books. But the whole point of this talk began at a science fiction convention about 20 years ago. It was this long, exhausting day, and I had some friends there from my MIT days, and one of my close MIT friends and her husband came up to me afterwards, and they asked, can you explain to me how this religion thing in your life works? Now, they knew that it was possible to be a fanatic and a nerd, the MIT ring and the collar. I'm a fanatic about my religion. I'm actually a fanatic about fanatic about religion, a nerd about my science, or is it I'm a fanatic about my science and whatever. I'm both. They knew that was possible, because here I am. The question was, how do you make it work? And the reason they were asking is that they had 2 young kids then, and they were, wondering, should we raise them in a religious faith? And now is the time for us to think about that. And that got me wondering. I know how I do it, but I'm weird. How do other people who are scientists and engineers deal with faith? How do techies deal with faith? It was an astonishing thing. I was a scientist before I entered the Jesuits. Once I entered the Jesuits, the most common reaction I got from my fellow scientists was, "You go to church?" Because obviously it wasn't obvious. "Let me tell you about the church I go to." And I go, "You go to church?" Because you'll find scientists of any religion you could think of, and probably some you hadn't. I met a scientist at Cornell who's a Zoroastrian. He's from the Middle East. That's, how he was raised. And there's more than one kind of Zoroastrianism, and his wife belongs to the other kind, so it's a mixed marriage. So, what is a techie? What is the kind of guy that I'm talking about? My people. Well, this is a really good friend of mine, Bill Higgins. He's a safety engineer at Fermilab. And I think he epitomizes a lot of what you would see in techies. It's somebody who makes a living as an engineer and a scientist, sure. But it's more than that. It's somebody whose orientation to the world is logical, functional, pragmatic. If you're an artist, you're going to ask, is it beautiful? If you're a philosopher, you're going to ask, is it true? If you're a techie, you're going to ask, how does it work? And techies, for better or worse, see the world in terms of problems to be solved, processes to be understood. How do they deal with religion? Usually it's also in terms of how does it work? I'm on a listserv with a bunch of guys, some of whom are very devoutly Jewish and others raised Jewish, but they want to know, okay, how do you guys, what does your rabbi say is the rule for if you're on Venus? How do you know when the Sabbath is? That sort of thing. And it's not to be snide, haha, you see, I caught you, but it's rather, that's a cool question. How would you do that? Incidentally, the rule right now is you follow the calendar of wherever it was when you were launched. In the future, when you're born on Mars, I don't know how it will work. About 20 years ago, I was invited to a Bible study group. Bible study? I'm Catholics, we don't do Bible study. It was actually a Bible study group in Houston. I'm going, oh, no. Southern Bible, no. It was a Bible study group in Houston with astronauts. Ooh, I get to meet astronauts. I could do that. And actually, about half the people in the group were Catholics. There was one guy there who was not a Catholic, who said, I understand we disagree on these things. I just want to let you know I am a creationist. The universe was created exactly word for word the way that it says in Genesis. And I'm thinking, has he actually read Genesis? Where it says the world is flat and there's a dome and water above and below the dome. And why doesn't the shuttle get wet? But as we talked some more, I discovered that, he had been a test pilot before he was an astronaut. And the one thing you do not want is a test pilot who will creatively interpret his instructions. Kind of ruins the point of the experiment. For a lot of engineers, following the rules is essential and central to what they do. It's part of the job description. You don't want to go to the Museum of Modern Art with an engineer unless they're interested in how does that sculpture work rather than what does it look like. There is a bigger issue underlying this, though. And it's not just about dealing with Scripture. It's what's dealing with our churches. This is Boston College. Boston College is an example of one of those churches built 150 years ago for immigrants who were blue-collar workers, laborers, in a church of blue-collar workers and laborers, and priests who came out of the blue-collar worker, laborer field who could talk to them. Thanks to all these universities, 4 generations later, the Catholics who are going to church tend to be well-educated doctors, scientists, engineers, IT techs. how many clergymen can talk to them? One of the interesting things you find is that the education level of people who go to church is actually higher than the education level of the society as a whole. We've lost the blue-collar people for whatever reason. Religious instructors, retreat directors, you spend a lot of time trying to develop the affective side of your personality, but you know, that word doesn't mean what you think it means if you're a techie. Affective sounds like affected. Well, as part of my Jesuit training, you stop and you're pulled out of whatever you're doing for a year. You do something called tertianship. And this is the last stage of your training before you go on to take final vows. And in tertianship, you live with a community. It's like your third year of being a novice. You learn the Jesuit constitutions. You do a long retreat. You do many other practices and classes. And then they turn you loose for a couple of months to do some kind of work really different from whatever it was you were doing before. Well, I'm a brother. I'm not a priest. They can't, let me loose in a parish. I'm useless there. I'm useless in most places. So I had the bright idea, I've been spending most of my life in a lab talking to the same 5 people, or with my colleagues, the same 20 people. What if I try to engage techies in spiritual conversation? The Jesuits have a university in Silicon Valley, Santa Clara University. So I arranged to live there for a few months. And every day I'd make first connections with people I knew in Silicon Valley, and then friends of theirs, and then friends and friends of theirs. And I would, make an appointment to go out for coffee and talk about religion. And I don't mean that I was talking to them. I'd pose a couple of questions and let them describe to me what religion was like. I then wound up writing this up in the God's Mechanics book, where I gave them new names sort of alphabetically, and I picked from A to Z. I have 26 names among them. So the names I'm giving you are not their real names, but it gives you a sense of what's going on. The first couple I actually met were, we'll call them Alan and Beth, an astronomer and a medical doctor. And they live in this 100-year-old house in an older part of Oakland, and it's full of an explosion of computers and toys, because their kids are growing up too. And as a matter of fact, they also are church shopping. They're trying to find a religion. She's kind of a fallen away Catholic. He described himself as a fallen away Unitarian, not very far to fall. He says the Unitarians were too sterile. They tried the Quakers. They said, in Northern California, the Quakers are too flaky. The woman who copy edited the book, reading that, she was a Northern California Quaker, and she goes, yeah, I know what they mean. And they had different things they were looking for. They wanted something that was both intellectually meaty, but also emotionally satisfying. So you wanted a theology, but you also wanted chants and drums. What are the things that you grade religions on? How did they do this? Are they looking for truth? In this case, Alan was saying, I would be satisfied with a religion that was not obviously false. And so any of the old-time religions, they've been around for 2,000 years. They probably got something going for them. I'm not going to buy one that's up, obviously. Northern California, what religions do you think they named as obviously false? Anybody?
Scientology.
Scientology, number 1, absolutely. They're not going to be Scientologists. Number 2, again, this is the Western U.S. Mormonism. I have done this for 10 years, and everybody gets those, and you're right. As it happens, my thesis director at MIT is a Mormon. There are a lot of really good Mormon scientists, but if you're not part of the flock, it looks like a really strange religion. It's fascinating, though, that that's what they were looking for. something that would function in the ways that they wanted a religion to function without being obviously untrue. What you're looking for when you're shopping for a religion and you're a techie depends on what are the functions you want it to perform. If it's going to bring you closer to God, then why do you believe in God? To the techie, the question doesn't mean, do I have a proof of God's existence? Rather, what's the rationale for bothering to care if there's a God or not? For some techies, believing in God is useful because it gives you an answer to the big questions like, why is there something instead of nothing? Those questions that bug you in 3 a.m. To some, it's a response to those inner longings that you have at 3 a.m. And Karl Rahner, in his wonderful book, Grundkurs der Glauben, describes this with the wonderful German words, the woraufhin and the wovor, which basically the thing inside you that is yearning for something transcendent and the thing that it is yearning for are both things that make the human being suspect there might be a God, and whatever it is, I don't even know what it is yet, but I'm going to label that as God. Rahner points out in the same book that it's interesting, so many cultures, so many languages, primitive and modern, have a word for God. It's one of those things that's a real common human experience. Next two people, Carol and David, both scientists at NASA Ames Research Center. They live in Mountain View. Their home is much cleaner because their kids are grown. There's a picture of his adult children and her adult children, and there's a history I won't ask about. Carol describes herself as a liberal Methodist. David is a non-believer. Carol says she uses believing as a way of orienting and structuring her life. Believing in God makes me a better person. That's why I continue to believe. And I'm thinking, that's pretty, functional. Doesn't have anything to do with truth. And David admits he can be moved at times when you're going to Christmas Eve services, but he explains this is why he's an atheist. He says, I was raised a Protestant, I was raised a Presbyterian. In my early 20s, I was active in a youth group, and the minister was great. The minister brought in one day a rabbi, and the rabbi was great. And the next week he brought in a Catholic priest. The Catholic priest was great. And I'm thinking to myself, but they can't all be true, so I guess none of them are true. And that's when he stopped believing. Now, when I tell this to the non-techie, they look at me funny like, that doesn't make any sense at all. But when I tell it to a physicist or an engineer, they go, oh, yeah, I can see that. What's going on? When you're a scientist and you're trying to figure out something and you turn a knob and nothing happens, you assume, okay, the knob isn't very important. Whatever that knob is controlling isn't very important. If there's no difference between being one kind of religion and another kind of religion, then the religion must not be an important knob. It's not connected to anything. Of course, he didn't turn it all the way over to Scientology. It's fascinating that these are the ways that a techie will think. It's part of this fundamental mindset of the techie. If all the religions are trying to get you to the one God, why are there so many religions? There aren't so many different kinds of physics, are there? Unless you're doing quantum physics. I taught one of the professors at Santa Clara was Greek Orthodox. He teaches a course for engineers that examines religion using the mathematical theory of chaos. To him, religions are different series approximations to the truth. Anybody here not know what a series approximation is? We're all good nerds here. Okay. If I have a complicated formula and I'm trying to approximate it by adding up 1, 1, 1, 1, 1, many different terms, each term will give me a curve that comes closer to closer, like, the curve of a sound wave, which looks very jagged, but it's built up of a bunch of sine waves. One set of sine waves coming from the violins, another from whatever. the more terms it takes to get to where you're going, the slower the series is converging. And he says the good religions are the ones that get you pretty close to the truth without having to add too many terms. The really bad ones are the ones that converge for a while and then diverge. I illustrate this not because I think it's true, but because I think it illustrates the techie way of thinking about a very non-techie problem. About halfway into this, I talked to a guy named, well, I was going to call him Jules, but in fact, he's given me permission to give his real name, which is Stranger. He lives up by San Francisco, and when I get there, well, this is what he looks like. Catane is the name. He's a Caltech graduate who makes his living as a photographer. That's one of his photographs. He's one of these guys who lives in both the world of the arts and the world of the sciences. And I remember he goes in and he says, would you like a cup of tea? Sure. So he opens the cabinet, and there are 27 jars with little flakes, little green flakes of plant material in them. And I'm assuming they're all teas and nothing else. None of them are labeled, but he can smell each one and tell you which kind of tea it is, because he's a nerd about his teas. That's who he is. So we get talking about this whole process and all the different answers I'd gotten from people. I describe my project, and then we start, like good nerds, classifying what are the kinds of answers I came up with. Number one, they can't all be right, so they must all be wrong. That was the one I talked about. They're all right, but they're just different descriptions of the same thing. They all have the same rules, be nice to your neighbor and don't kill people. Therefore, since rules equals content, therefore they all have the same content by this point of view. I remember one of the guys I interviewed had been a Catholic, and he left the Catholic Church because it had too many rules, and then he married a woman who was a Seventh-day Adventist, so now he's a Seventh-day Adventist. Talk about too many rules. Never mind. Different religions are like different computer operating systems. The one that's right depends on how you're wired. You can't run a PC operating system on a Mac. And like computer systems, some religions have more features than others, but with the more features you've got, the more likelihood you're going to have of having bugs. It's just the way things work. This is different from just saying that all religions are right, because it says one religion might be right for you better than all the other ones. A different religion might be right for you better than all the other ones. That's the way that logic works. Different religions are different approximations to the truth, and some converge faster than the other. We saw that one. Different religions are like different kinds of physics. Aristotle did a good job of explaining the world in a very practical sense. The Greeks were able to walk across the world without tripping on falling over with Aristotle's physics. Newton came along and said, we can do better than that. Quantum came along and said, we can do better than Newton. So you've got these different levels that work to different degrees, but ultimately there's only one that matches the truth in all its completeness. And hey, guess which one that is? It must be my religion. Certainly, the Catholic theology is as hard to understand as quantum physics. If you think you understand it, you don't. One of the things I noticed later on is that there are some of these, versions 1 and 4 and 5, differentiate religions on the basis of are they true. Numbers 2 and 3 differentiate them on the basis of how do they work. There's a difference between engineers and scientists. Scientists tend to be more on the is it true side, and the engineers more on the how does it work side. I go on for these 2 months. I'm talking to professors, to students, young Turks, senior executives, theorists, a lot of differences, but eventually I find a common thread. The typical techie has got serious questions about what's true when he's in college, and it's usually a he. A lot of them abandon organized religion at that point, but they never abandon the search for God or the search for truth. And then they get married, and then they start a family, and then they wonder, how am I going to raise these kids? And they wind up going to church more often than not, the wife's church, regardless of which one of them is the techie. But even while they didn't abandon God, though they abandoned church-going, later on, though they're churchgoers again, they still don't abandon that cynicism, that questioning, that searching that they had in the first place. They just learn to live with it. Techies who are old enough to be parents are the ones you might find going to church. But why do they go to church? It's not to obtain truth or values, because they think by the time you're 40, you've already got that. What they tell me is they're just looking for a place where they're comfortable dealing with those values. And it's good to have them challenged, but not too much. They want a place where they can pass these values on to their kids. And the kids, on the other hand, are going to be skeptical of organized religion as they go through exactly that same pattern. The things about religion that I would have thought would be appealing to a techie actually are downplayed nowadays. For instance, the Catholic Church can make the claim that we have this apostolic succession going all the way back to Peter. There is a chart you can buy in the gift shop at St. Peter's with the listing all the popes in order. I think there's 250 some of them or 350 some of them. How many popes have there been? There must be a theologian here who knows that. Whatever. 256? 266. That sounds about right. We'll assume that's true. And, for most Catholics, you say, oh, that's cute. I had a scientist friend of mine looking, you can actually do that? You can actually make that connection? Well, yeah, because where do you think they came from? Mean value theorem. If there's something here and something there, it had to be, popes in between. And this blew his mind. But when was the last time you heard anybody talking about apostolic succession? It's kind of embarrassing, because it makes you the Anglican sort of uncomfortable. The church itself, St. Peter's Cathedral, to a lot of Americans, it's garish and, oh, look at all the money. If we could have given that money to the poor, sounding much like Judas. But there was another guy, another astronomer, who was in town to use his instrument on our telescope to look at an occultation. He had a few free days. We did the tourist stuff in Rome. We're going into St. Peter's. He was another one who claimed to be a fallen away Unitarian. And as we're walking through St. Peter's, about halfway through, he's just getting this weirder and weirder look on his face. Okay, he goes, Guy, the people who built this place, they believe this stuff. Oh, yeah, I believe this stuff. Yeah, what's it? No. They really He went back home and joined a church. Not a Catholic church, but he joined a church. The power that's expressed in the immensity of St. Peter's, the idea of apostolic succession, all builds into what is the authority with which the church claims to be able to teach. And you never hear ministers of the church talk about authority. It's all, we're all sinners together. Let's all reach out and, find God together. That's the way that you usually hear. And for most people, I think that's probably the way you want to hear it. But when you're a nerd, you're an expert. You're like the centurion in the gospel who says to Jesus, I know what authority is because I'm an authority. I know what authority looks like. And if you discount authority, then you're discounting what makes me, the chief engineer, more important than, that suit over there who just gives me the money to do the work. It's also typical for techies who have a high opinion of themselves to wonder, why should I listen to that guy on a dress up at the pulpit trying to tell me how to live? What does he know that I don't know? Ministers who don't let people know that they've got some sort of authority and expertise not only don't have a reason to have people listen to them. They are implicitly disrespecting authority. And here are some three authorities. Millikan, the guy who worked out that the electron was a point. Einstein, relativity. And the guy in between with the familiar collar and the familiar MIT ring, though he didn't have a ring, they didn't have rings yet, he was an MIT grad. Georges Lemaitre, the father of the Big Bang, happened to be a Belgian priest. Authorities, each in their field, who could speak to each other. Back to my Silicon Valley. One day, I'm meeting with a friend of mine. I'm going to call him Xavier. You can see him getting to the end of the alphabet. He's in his late 20s. He says he's an atheist. He works at, St. Peter's of Silicon Valley, #1 Apple Way, Infinite Loop, or whatever that road is called. He's no stranger to religious and evangelical sales pitches. He's no stranger to the power of a centralized authority. He says he thinks most people who belong to churches probably use that membership for a sense of community. And, he's single, he doesn't need a community, so why bother? I'm still having a hard time bending my head around the idea that techies only want to belong to a church for the community to teach their kids. And then he throws me another techie church parallel. What people are going to church for, he tells me, isn't what you think you're selling. You think you're selling them truth, but they don't want truth. They think they've already got truth. What you're really selling them is tech support. Once a week scheduled maintenance. Thinking of repairmen, thinking of maintenance. I head off to lunch with the ethnologist Julian Orr, which really is his name. He's not one of the people. Julian Orr wrote this book talking about machines. He was an anthropologist. And for his thesis at Cornell, he decided to do a study of the anthropology of Xerox copier repairmen, which are really interesting characters because they work for a big company like Xerox, but they're never at the company headquarters. They're on the road someplace else all the time. What they do, if you're a Xerox copier repairman, is you hang out at Denny's with your other repairman waiting for your pager to buzz, drinking coffee, and swapping stories about the crazy thing you had to fix. Xerox machines are very complicated, and they tend to break. And the company, in its wisdom, has come up with a thick book of, if this happens, do that. If this happens, do that. But in fact, human beings are even more creative than the people at the headquarters think, and there's nothing in the book about how you fix a machine when somebody left a bologna sandwich in the paper feed. That's why they depend on back engineering. Well, because they don't actually tell the repairman how the machine works. They just tell the repairman how to fix it. So they invent their own sense of how they think the machine works, which allows them to then fix it. And if they're really good, they're not far from the truth. Because they have made the decision that the company doesn't want them to follow the rules. The company wants them to make the customers happy, which is a very different sort of thing. And then it hits me, that's a lot of how techies engage in religion. They agree with the overall goals that they hear from the church. They may not have a particularly high opinion about the documentation that's coming from the church, but they do appreciate what the church is trying to do. And so they have this unspoken contempt of anyone who's going to follow the documentation literally, and even more those suits in management who are going to insist on that, because they know that just following a cookbook doesn't mean you know how to actually cook. And I find the example of this a few days later. I'm up to Y, and I'll call this guy Yaz. He's a scientist, he's in his 40s, he's a very devout, active Lutheran. In a fairly conservative branch of the Lutheran Church, he's kind of rejecting the bobblehead Jesus of his mom's church, that generation of 60s types. No. he finds the presence of liturgy and Sunday communion to be really important to him. It's not so much the ritual, it is the theological content along with the community. But there was one ritual that he was very hungry for, which his church didn't provide. So he had to go to City Hall to marry his gay partner. There he is, active, committed, conservative Lutheran, living in a permanent, committed gay relationship. And I can see how this works. The church says, if you're going to be in a sexual relationship, it should be permanent, it should be blessed. This is the only way I can do it. This is satisfying God. God understands, even if it's not in the rules of the church. Just like a Xerox repairman is going to provide customer satisfaction, even if it's not following the rule book of the Xerox repair manual. And finally, when I look back at these different ideas, I'm beginning to pull things out that I didn't see at first. First is the commitment that these techies have to their faiths. You know, we only have so many hours in the day, and one way we try to do all the things we love to do is to multitask. So sharing books, playing games, listening to music, going to movies, yeah, you can relax then, but at the same time, there are moments when we can contemplate the big questions. So we like the kind of books that make you think, the way that a good science fiction book will make you think. You like the kind of music that also puts you into a meditative stance, New Age music, that sort of thing. In a fantasy novel, you can deal with conflicts of good and evil. That's the techie version of meditation and prayer. But meditation and prayer, that's spirituality. What about religion itself? You know, is that just a lifestyle choice like Peet's Coffee versus Starbucks? When the techie is not religious, that's what they think the religious techies are doing. And that's what I hear from them. I remember I was thinking of joining the Jesuits 30 years ago. I eventually did. And a great friend of mine, somebody I'd known since we were all students together, was looking over the literature. And she says, you know, this stuff looks pretty cool. Good, you know, being a Jesuit sounds cool. If it weren't for all the religious stuff, I could be really attracted to it. The more I look over my interviews and think about these, the more I realize that for the techies who do belong to a church, it is more than lifestyle or community or what you would get belonging to a bowling league. The techies do have a religious life. When they go to church, it's for something that we would call the God stuff, the religious stuff. But they have a very, very deep reticence about talking about it. They won't talk about it even to their best friends for fear of the kind of reaction they'll get. They won't talk about it even to a family member. They won't talk about their religious lives even to themselves. But there wasn't one techie who I interviewed, whether they called themselves atheist or believer, who didn't know what I was talking about when I asked the questions. All of them, all of us, deal with the religious questions. And this brings up an interesting side note. If being a techie gives you this angle on religion, this functional angle, I also saw that being a techie can give you certain dangers. You know, like I said, you think that you're the smartest guy in the room. You think you're smarter than everyone else. We're really trained at our work, so I can fix a widget better than anybody else. Therefore, I must be able to fix a religion. If only they asked me, I could tell them how to do it. And scientists especially are prone to this. You've got Stephen Hawking, who writes these books of philosophy, really dreadful philosophy, because he never took philosophy 101. And then says, but of course, I'm not a philosopher because they're inferior to what I am, a physicist. You've got Neil deGrasse Tyson, who cannot have an idea without tweeting about it. And he's got an opinion about everything, no matter how far it is from his realm of expertise. And both of these people are actually nice guys. I know Neil Tyson. He's had me on his radio show. He's a sweet character. Just a little narrow in his thinking, I think. But engineers are vulnerable to a different kind of mistake. Scientists are the guys who, if you're a scientist, you've got to convince the other scientists so you've got something to talk about or you go nowhere. If you're an engineer, you don't care what people think of you because you can fix that widget better than anybody else. And your self-identity is, I'm the smartest guy in the room, especially if the other people in the room are those suits. Well, if you're the smartest guy in the room, how can you ever agree with the majority? What's the point of being smarter than everybody else if you agree with everybody else? And these are the guys who wind up becoming believers in the face on Mars, believers in UFOs, believers in some very strange religions. And dare I say, the kind of anti-vax people we've seen in the last couple of years. The fact that nobody else believes these things just reinforces, well, of course they don't, because I'm smarter than them. It goes back to the sense of authority. You see the bumper stickers or the budget, question authority. Question authority, says who? Just because you've got a bumper sticker, why should I do that? Galileo is held up as the great skeptic and the inventor of the scientific method, and both are true. And he was a great scientist. But there is a recent biography by Hilbrun of Galileo that underscores where did Galileo become a skeptic? He became a skeptic questioning authority because that's what his teachers and his father taught him to be. Think of the irony there. And as I say, you've got people, follow the science. Of course, anyone who's actually trying to convince an evangelical with that phrase doesn't realize that the evangelical says, I should follow the science, instead of Jesus who says, follow me. And they're then suddenly holding up science against religion. It's guaranteed to turn off the very people you think you're convincing. This temptation, the theologians among you will recognize, it's called Gnosticism. It's the desire for the hidden truth. It's the desire to say that I know better, because I found this secret knowledge on the internet, which of course, because it's on the internet, anybody could have found it, but I found it in my basement, when I was all by myself, and it sounds like only I know this. I know about authority. I'm a scientist. I also work for the church. I sometimes point out that, as a planetary scientist working for the church, I have to deal every day with a big, hulking, sometimes infuriatingly stupid, insensitive, tone-deaf authority. Why do I put up with them? Because, so far, NASA is the only outfit that was able to get us to the moon. And it's only by bringing all of us, crazy people to work together and more or less, herding all these cats to go in the same direction that we were able to get to the moon. Science has gone wrong in the past. There have been science popularizers in the end of the 19th century who not only said that science will replace religion, but I can show you where science is replacing religion because modern science has shown us how we can improve the human race. It's called eugenics. And the people who are against eugenics are these backwards-looking religious people like William Jennings Bryant. And it took 50 years of science to show that eugenics is a bunch of crap. It doesn't work. And it took the Nazis to show where it leads if you follow it too closely. But there were forced sterilizations, usually of minorities, happening, sponsored by the US government, into the 1970s. And the modern version of it is, genetic testing, and if I can find the gene that makes you a criminal, then I'll abort you. Maybe it doesn't work that easily. The Scopes trial about, teaching evolution, if you see the textbook that Scopes was using, it was a eugenics textbook, explaining why white people were superior to everybody else. Because we're rich, Therefore, the experiment showed that being white makes you rich. Therefore, white people must be better than... What is the weird logic there? But that was the way that people thought. And if you tried to oppose it, you are being anti-science. After that, no wonder a lot of people said, well, if that's what being anti-science is, then I'll be anti-science. And that's a tragedy for science. What is going on besides this desire for authority and this fear of authority is the desire for certainty. Along with that desire for certainty is this Calvinistic intolerance of error. Failure is not an option. And true in our church as well, infallibility. Except if you read the papal infallibility, you realize it's the only, the Pope is the only boss I've ever had who will admit he's not infallible on most things, because it's very limited what he is claiming infallibility for. So limited that, in essence, it recognizes that we are fallible. Because the irony is that science depends on error. If science works, it shows that what we thought we knew isn't true anymore. In science, failure is not an option, it's a requirement. And that means that while science is the best way to understand the world, and the one that gives you the best odds of surviving a pandemic, it's not going to be perfect. And it's never going to be perfect. And if you demand perfection, you're missing the point. Just as an example of this sense of perfection. When I was at MIT, I was in the sailing team. I sailed boats like that on the Charles River. Be pretty windy on that river. It can be, the winds can shift an awful lot. In the 3 years that I was on the sailing team, I never once capsized my dinghy. And I never once won a race. Yeah, there's a correlation. You have to be willing to admit that you are wrong, to push things to the point where they break, in order to see just how far you can go and to discover what's going to work and not going to work. Doubt is an essential part of our faith. Paul Tillich wrote this whole essay about doubt and faith, which was summarized nicely by the writer Anne Lamott, who says, the opposite of faith isn't doubt. The opposite of faith is certainty. If you were certain, you wouldn't need faith. But in reality, life is making choices on the basis of inadequate information, where you could be wrong, but you got to make a choice anyway. Should I come to the University of Toronto? Should I marry this person? Should I take this job? You don't know that ahead of time. Sometimes you make mistakes. I transferred out of the first college I went to. And when you admit that, then you could admit that you can love people even when they make mistakes. Maybe you can even love yourself and admit that you made mistakes. Something that's sometimes hard for techies to do. I knew a priest who had been an engineer, became a priest, and when he said Mass, it was as if rubrics were the essence of the Mass. If he dropped a semicolon, then the Mass wouldn't compile. And the transubstantiation wouldn't happen. Because he thinks he's doing it. Science and religion only can seem to be in conflict when you think of both of them as closed books of rules. If all you think of science is to get the answers in the back of the book, then you have never actually done science. Science is when you finished the book and now you want to do the things that don't have answers yet. If you think that religion is just following the rules, you've never encountered God. Because God will challenge you to go places where there are no rules. I think of the desire to be experts rather than the desire to be good. Good at being a scientist, good at being an engineer, good at being a religious person. If you read what was going on in France and Belgium in the 19th century, there were tremendous fights among the theologians. And every time you read about what they were arguing about, you realize they were both wrong. But in the meanwhile, there were also tremendous saints who were not caught up in those fights at all, like St. Teresa. There's a lesson there for us. If your sense of self-worth comes from thinking you're the smartest guy in the world, or the smartest guy at least in the room, then you can never agree with the rest of the world. You can never think you could learn from the rest of the world. If you think that cleverness or intelligence is the standard by which you're better than everyone else, but the standard by which you will grade yourself, then you will forget that there's so many more dimensions to intelligence that can't be measured in one dimension. This was off the top. I taught one semester at Lemoyne College, which is this wonderful Jesuit school in upstate New York, in Syracuse, and it tends to get a lot of non-traditional students, or maybe in their early 30s. Pre-professionals are going to be doctor's aides, pharmacist aides, things like that. Real different from the MIT students I had taught 10 years earlier. And I'm in the classroom, and there was one of the students is giving a student presentation, and she's talking about this sort of idea and that sort of idea, and it's, and she says, actually, this is something I remember learning about when we were studying Aristotle. And the student sitting in the desk next to me, I'm in the student giving the presentations desk, the student in the desk next to me lets out this horrible, oh, rolls her eyes, and I'm thinking, boy, she must not like Aristotle. But that's kind of rude. The student next to her jumps out of his desk, grabs her, lays her down on the floor. Another student pulls out his cell phone, calls campus patrol and says, we have somebody who's had a seizure, describes the symptoms, says what classroom they're in. I couldn't remember what the number of the classroom was. Within 5 minutes, medical help is, she had had a seizure. And afterwards I realized if that had been an MIT class, nobody would have noticed. There's more than one kind of intelligence. Since I don't want to rag on MIT too much, there was somebody who was visiting Caltech and said, do these people all dress themselves in the dark? There's more than one kind of intelligence. How dare you say that intelligence is how I'm going to rank myself being better than someone else? I finally end with the realization that science and technology is something that is in our society, and it's also a social justice trait. Curiosity about the world is a human trait, and if you don't support people's ability to be curious of the world, you are denying them their humanities. The technological approach to the world shows how you can take big, impossible problems and break them into smaller problems that you can be solved. That's how we make progress in social justice. Okay, the mechanical view of the world of a techie is incomplete. Show me a worldview that isn't incomplete. It's the only worldview that gives us the courage to think we can attack problems like poverty and disease and injustice. Okay, so your typical techie is kind of a cold bird who doesn't know what affective means. How can you reach them except by reaching them where they are? Jesus was a techie. And I don't just mean, he was male and single and smarter than everybody around him. And when he tried improving the world, he got crucified for it. The techne, he was a carpenter. He made things. He wasn't a philosopher. Him speaking to the Pharisees would be like, Joe the plumber speaking to a bunch of college professors. Only, unlike other Joes the plumber, he had something to say. But there can be this sense of alienation. The techies are as much looking for truth and God and a structure in which to find truth and God as any of the rest of us. They still believe. You may call them mechanics, but they're God's mechanics. And, oh yeah, my friends wound up raising their kids Episcopalian. He wound up being a warden in the church. The kids are now in their 20s, very cynical, don't believe in that kind of stuff. Wait till they have a family. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Brother Guy. We'll take some time for questions, and maybe you can moderate yourself.
I will take questions about anything. If I don't want to answer it, I'll tell you. But there can be questions about the stuff I mentioned here, the techies I talk to, friends you have, or yourself, or or just questions about what it's like to work at the Vatican. What does the Pope have for breakfast? I have no idea. So we'll start at the back. Yeah.
I was wondering, you talk about the importance of authority, but also say that curiosity, like limiting it, was like denying people of the humanity.
So there's this tension between authority and curiosity, right? And you need both. You need an authority that gives you the space to be curious, but will then rein you in if A, what you're doing is likely to hurt somebody, including yourself, or B, we already tried that. Where is what you're doing different? And science has this tension because, on the one hand, we encourage people to think outside the box, as the cliche goes, but at the same time, it's a rare scientist who's given the total freedom to study anything. Generally, you study with teams of people who are being paid by somebody to do something, even if it's a research grant to study black holes. And therefore, you have to go to a committee and justify what it is you want to do. You are credited with great things if you're able to come up with a new idea. But the new idea has to be part of the ongoing conversation. So if I have such a new idea that it doesn't fit into any academic discipline, I could well be right. But, if somebody wanted to talk about black holes to Isaac Newton, he would be wasting his breath because the rest of the community wouldn't be ready to hear what they had to say. And this is the tension of doing science. It's not just me and nature, it's the community of everyone around me and nature. And I need the discipline to stop thinking of myself as the smartest guy in the room. And going to a school where there's a whole lot of smart people is generally a pretty humbling experience because you learn very quickly, no, you weren't. Yeah?
How often do you see the Pope?
Generally about a couple of times a year, not every day. There will be events where there will be papal audiences. And if there's a particular reason why we want an audience, we can ask for it, and the odds would be pretty good we get one. So I'll give you some examples. There was a meeting of Jesuit brothers from around the world this past summer, and the Pope came to our meeting. He's a Jesuit, he lives across the street, why not? We have a summer school every 2 years. If there are any astronomers or astrophysicists in the room, and don't have your PhD yet, think about looking up Vatican Observatory and look up summer school and see how you can apply to a summer school, which is about big data. The only rule is you've got to be really good because we get about 100 people applying for 25 slots and no more than 2 from any country. So if you come from a country with a smaller population, you got an itch. And the Pope will, we will ask, will he talk to the 25 students? And he'll give us an audience for them. There was one time when we were having a gathering of both the Jesuits at the observatory in Tucson and the Jesuits at the observatory in Rome, and we were all together at the same place. And we said this would be a great time to just see if the Pope would come and say hi. And we can introduce ourselves to him. And we just sat around for an hour shooting the breeze. No agenda, telling stories. He's a Jesuit, we're a Jesuit, we knew people in common. We could say, do you remember old so-and-so? Oh, yeah, and we'd tell funny stories about him. I've gotten to know 3 popes this way. JP2 was young and healthy when I first met him, and he was a nice guy, but I wasn't all that impressed. When he got old and frail, he became phenomenally powerful. So that you're in his presence and you're going, oh, wow, I don't know what it is, but it's there. And our students at the summer schools would come away from the audience, especially the non-believing students would come away going, I don't know what that was, but that was scary. Benedict, of course, came across as a German professor lecturing the world, because he was a German professor. But in small groups, he was charming, he was great to talk to, and he has a wicked sense of humor, which you would never have guessed. And Francis, what you see is what you get. In private and in public, he's pretty much the same. Yeah.
When people speak about the Catholic Church and science, what detractors will often go to is how the Pope treated Galileo, even though
Right.
he had been paying the bills for many years. Can you tell us a bit about the controversy with Galileo and any sort of misinformation people have?
Yeah, it's interesting that you mentioned the conflict of science and religion, and everybody talks about Galileo, which they have to because it's the only one they got. There's so much science that was done by religious people. Most science in the 17th and 18th and 19th centuries, before there were big government grants, was either done by people who were independently wealthy or clergymen. Because who else had the free time and the education to do it? And what is most science but data collecting, data sorting? We used to do 3x5 cards in file cabinets. Now we've got Excel spreadsheets. What do you call filing and sorting data? It's called clerical work. Why is it called clerical? Because it was done by clerics. There is in that book, Would You Baptize in E.T., a long chapter about Galileo. Everything you know about Galileo is wrong. The truth does not make the church look any better. But it's important to know that the mistake the church made is not the mistake that people think it made. It was not Galileo's science that got him into trouble. There were other scientists. Galileo didn't have the goods. He didn't have the proofs he was looking for. The people who are anti-Galilean had better scientific evidence on their side, so they thought. So the real question is, well, what was Galileo's problem? And the answer is, we're not sure. Because Galileo for 20 years was embraced by the church, and then suddenly in 2 years everything fell in on him with a pope who was his good friend. And then a year after that he was able to go back home and write more books. The Galileo myth that everybody knows doesn't date from Galileo's time. It dates from the end of the 19th century, and I think it was tied to eugenics. And they were trying to find a reason to beat up on the church. And they said, well, look what they did to Galileo. So it's a fascinating story, because it's a story of how do myths get born. And why is it that everybody's heard of Einstein, but nobody's heard of Schrodinger? Or they know Schrodinger because of a funny story, but they don't know Niels Bohr. There's a friend of mine claimed, everybody wants to make me an Einstein, but instead everybody calls me a Bohr. Yeah.
Would you say that the vested interests within scientific organizations and the vested interests within religious organizations are equally resistant to the correction of error?
Are vested interests interested in the correction of error? There are vested interests who are interested in resisting the correction of error in any human organization. There are also those who are looking for errors to correct because that makes them rebels, and the rebels of this generation become the establishment that needs to be rebelled against in the next generation. I'm old enough to have seen that happen. Here comes the new boss, same as the old boss. What is certainly true is that science and religion are both composed of human beings who are subject to original sin, who are going to be greedy, and who are going to be lustful, and who are going to be envious, and are also going to be doing the stuff because they love it, and more desirous of finding out what's true. Even if there's also that edge. I want to find out what's true, and I want to be the guy who finds it out. So there is that tension in the work we do. Absolutely. I see a lot of people are getting up because their time has come to an end. So I'll take one last question, and yeah.
Thanks, Brother Guy. I like your talk and also what you said about authority and curiosity. It reminds me of C.S. Lewis's image, I think, of the map. That when you're going on a journey or something, it's nice to have a map. It's accumulated wisdom of all it, but you also can add to that map by discovering something new.
Yeah.
For the educators in the room or the parents or anybody else, we're used to dealing with a lot of students and young people, and the common refrain, and as a Jesuit I hear it too, is I'm spiritual but not religious.
Spiritual but not religious,
And I
yeah.
ask students what they mean by that. And they say, well, religion's just following all those rules, and
Right.
it's patriarchy and it's outdated, blah, blah, blah. Whereas spirituality is
Mhm.
me and my search for God, etc. Is that something you heard from techies, or how do you respond? And if
Yes.
you didn't hear it from techies, how would you respond to that?
You do hear that from techies who are very cynical about rules that they didn't invent themselves. The real question is, where did you hear about the spirituality? You're going to find Jesus on your own. Where did you hear about Jesus? How was this transmitted to you, and how are you going to transmit your wisdom to the next generation? That's why we need structure. That's why we need universities. That's why we need somebody who will grade the classes and give you the certificate that, yes, you passed. And yes, you're good enough to go on to the next stage. I think that urge is the urge, the cynicism of, in some ways, rejecting the God of childhood. And that's a good God to reject, because that God isn't true. Just like you go through a stage where your parents are perfect, then you go through your stage where your parents are incredibly stupid. And to quote the Mark Twain line, I thought my dad was an idiot when I was 15, and I was amazed how smart he'd become by the time I was 25. And it's just a phase that we have to go through as human beings, testing the boundaries, and then going back and saying, oh, that's what they were talking about. So what we really need is the unconditional love and patience, which we hope that God has for us as we do the same thing. Thanks, everybody, for coming.
Feel free to help yourself to refreshments. Stick around and mingle if you'd like. And I'm sure Brother Guy would be interested in talking to anyone who wants to approach him
Sure.
personally. So, thank you.
Thanks for coming.